Just another manic Monday. World economic news? Let's start. United States CoreLogic House Price Index, calculated risk, wonderful. I've used this a few times, showing that house prices in the United States have kind of come down that big slope and have been trying to find a place in life. And they've just been muddling along. Dare I say that over the last couple of months they're kind of deciding that they might want to turn down again. Have a look at the chart. What do you think? More charts. Right. Conference Board Consumer Confidence Index. It's an important one. It's a Doug Short chart, and you can see the blue line has taken a good hike up, but the regression line is where one would kind of expect it to be, and it's still well below, but it is trying to hack its way up there. So we can say that's quite positive. It's quite positive. The next is the NFIB Small Business Optimism Index. We're all on psychology here, and again it's a similar thing with the average, mean, median, I don't know what you call it, that 100 line. It's well below at 94.5, but it is heading in the right direction. It's slowly clawing its way back, and that's small business optimism. That's the psychology of small businesses. But we get the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, which is another important one, and it was trying to get its way back up to normal levels. But the last input was very negative, and it sent the pump monkeys on Bubble Vision a bit negative. And understandably, it would have been so much nicer if that had pointed upwards and not pointed downwards, that last stroke. But it didn't, it pointed downwards. And is it surprising, really? We're on consumer sentiment here. Gas prices going up is a direct knife into the guts of the consumer. They already were dealing with health insurance prices, cost of tuition, college tuition, and the nagging doubt whether college tuition is even worth it anymore. So let's go to the Fed flow of funds and growth of domestic non-financial debt. Now, the big yellow line across the middle is to divide the years from the breakdown of 2009 and 2010. It's good to see the breakdown of 2009 and 2010, but if we stick with the years simply on the top, and we note across the top we have households, business, state and local governments, and federal. Now, this is percentage changes of non-financial debt. That is non-financial. Debt's obviously financial, but it's outside the banking. It's not. We're not talking about banks here. There's another statement which includes banks and things. But this is. Let's go to households to get a handle on where we are. So the first grouping is 2001 to 2005, the first part of the decade, and it was kind of boom years for households taking on debt, leverage as they like to call it, but it's taking on debt. And you can see they're all averaging around 10% increase year on year, compounding. That's a stuff of a lot of debt. And then you can see in the second half of the decade, it kind of came under pressure. It went straight in at 10 again in 2006, but you could see that the end was nigh with 6.8 in 2007. And since then, it's been negative, negative, negative. Not big negative, but certainly not the boom years of the early part of the decade. Important, because so much is predicated on debt. Move over to business, and they weren't doing the booming 10% pluses. They were averaging around 5% at the start of the decade there, ticking along nicely. They kind of got to the game late in 2006 and 7 and got up over 10%, but then realized they'd made a mistake in 2008, came down to 6%, went negative in 2009 and just positive in 2010. Now, this is Edward Harrison of Credit Write-Downs that has dragged this and put the green there, because he's, if you follow the link, it's talking about businesses getting more confidence as related by the Doug Short charts there, and they're going out and borrowing more I ask, what are they borrowing for? But you can see that they are just about positive in borrowing. State and local government, start of the decade, averaging about 8% there, maybe a little bit more. And it has come down slightly as the recession hit. But it's always positive. State and local governments are always borrowing lots of money. And those compounding, that's a lot of money that's being borrowed by state and local governments. And federal over at the end there, they started slow because they didn't have to come in heavy, but then they were getting up towards 10% towards the end of the first half of the decade. Very reasonable in 6 and 7 when they had income from the boom. But then when it all went bust, they have gone in heavy. 24.2, 22.7 and 20.2. That is a huge amount of borrowing, and that's where the trillions are coming in on the deficit. 1.6, 1.7 trillion dollar deficits. And the question is, where would the economy be without that federal spending? And we ask ourselves, maybe, do they know about MMT and the accounting niceties, or are they just Keynesians, or are they just desperate idiots? It's very hard to know, but without that federal spending, we ask ourselves, where would the United States economy be? Better move on. Bruce Crasting. Oops, where does this go? Daniel Mudd, the former CEO of Fannie Mae, got a Wells notice from the SEC on Friday. A Wells notice is a come on down, come and talk to us. I have been waiting years for this to happen. There is good reason this action is so late in coming. This case could open the door for culpability of the federal government in the collapse of the US mortgage agencies. And that's Daniel Mudd, as in the mud comes after the rains at Fannie. And I've been talking about the law grinds very slowly, and it's on the ground floor, and it's kind of burning upwards. And this is kind of a spark that's kind of jumped up towards the top. And BK is quite happy about this because he's obviously got a thing in for Daniel Mudd, which is strange. Everybody has a kind of a baddie alarm, don't they? You know, it just sets off a baddie alarm. Mudd has set the baddie alarm off for me as well, I must say, but Siren over at Freddie set it off even more. But not all the participants in this fiasco have set it off. People like Lloyd Blankfiend doesn't set my baddie alarm off at all. It doesn't mean that I don't think he's a baddie. It means that the actual internal feeling alarm hasn't gone off, which is odd. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But yeah, for me, Siren is the real clanger there. Fed report finds no wrongful foreclosures by banks. Consumer advocates slam the methodology. Again, Bernanke doesn't set my baddie alarm off either. But Washington, D.C., a months-long internal investigation into abusive mortgage practices by the Federal Reserve. No, the Federal Reserve have done the internal investigation. A months-long internal investigation into the abusive mortgage practices by the Federal Reserve found no wrongful foreclosures, members of the Fed's Consumer Advisory Council said on Thursday. And this is, I'll just read you a paragraph and it explains just how silly this is. Kirsten Keefe, a member of the Fed's Consumer Panel and an attorney at the Empire Justice Center in Albany, New York, said the Fed's report defined wrongful foreclosures as repossessions of borrowers' homes who were not significantly behind on their payments. Bit of a negative thing there, but you'll get it from this next paragraph. Based on that definition, the homeowners were already in default. The Fed found the foreclosures to be justified, members said. But so the Fed have basically said if they weren't paying their mortgage, then it wasn't a wrongful foreclosure. And it's quite right. The Fed aren't the right people to be looking into the paperwork that went in behind it. That's a legal thing. It only goes to show that this was a complete farce. How much of these Fed things that they do are a complete farce. But talking about central banks, Corner Turn blog gives us the latest Irish Central Bank data that's just been released. Now, you'd think that the Irish Central Bank should be just on the golf course, because the European Central Bank does all the central banking, and the sovereign central banks really don't have anything to do. Well, they don't normally, unless they get special dispensation from the ECB to do some good old central banking, and the Irish Central Bank have got that dispensation under the proviso. Repeat, the proviso is that if it goes wrong, they go screaming to their Irish Treasury and not to the permission-giving ECB. Anyway, I read on. The latest Irish Central Bank data has just been released. It was expected that the ELA, that's the emergency lending, accounted for in other assets would drop by 17.5 billion, that's euros, to reflect the FRNs that were issued by the Irish banks in January. These FRNs, these floating rate things, where the Irish banks go, I'll print up a bond, and who's going to pay for it? I'll pay for it. You'll pay for it, I'll pay for it. Writes a cheque and buys their own bonds. It's that sort of con. So they expected that to make everything a little bit better for the Irish Central Bank. So the expected figure would be in the region of 34 billion. The number showed the complete opposite. Other assets at the end of February stood at 70 billion, nearly doubled. And there's the table there. This is, needless to say, shocking, when it seems to show that what it seems to show is that the funding situation of the Irish banks have reached critical stroke disastrous levels. And when that goes wrong, it'll fall on the Irish Treasury, and the Irish Treasury will fall on the Irish people. New York Times, China's February inflation held at 4.9%, held at 4.9. That's general food inflation's in double figures. China's consumer prices rose sharply again in February despite government efforts to cool surging inflation that communist leaders worry might fuel unrest. Fuel unrest because your food goes up. Yeah. The announcement Friday came after Beijing promised sweeping efforts this week to improve the life for China's poor majority. So what's that, a billion people? With higher wages and subsidies, subsidizing food, yeah. Inflation could undercut that campaign by eroding the public's economic gains. What, you give them higher wages so they pay more for food, which increases inflation, so you've got to include the wages. Yeah, we've been through that. Wasn't any fun. Down at the bottom, and we'll finish with these two paragraphs. Demand has been fueled by economic growth that hit 10.3% last year. The expansion is slowing as Beijing curbs its lending boom. The International Monetary Fund has forecast 9.6% growth this year, not 10.3%. And as if they know what the IMF know about China's growth. GDP, I mean... Last paragraph. Beijing has tried to mollify the public by paying food subsidies to poor families and ordering local leaders to see vegetable markets have adequate supplies. Ordering local leaders to see vegetable markets have adequate supplies. What seems to happen in the world of the world, when things are going well, all the people in the ladder, the hierarchy ladder, all have their little input. We can do this, we can do that. And, like in China, as soon as the input's put in, they take their little cut and whatever. But everyone's really keen to get on. But as soon as things turn down, all the lower people on the ladder go, ooh, up, and everybody looks up and kind of goes all very quiet. And what happens is there's only one rung at the top of the ladder, which in this case is the Chinese Politburo, who have to then issue all sorts of orders, and they can't possibly issue all the right orders for the 4 billion people of China, and you get things like this, ordering local leaders to see vegetable markets have adequate supplies. You'll get that adequate supplies, or I cut your balls off. You little bastard. And it goes from bad to worse, normally. Bye.